What is the carb scam? This is the scam that has been foisted onto humans for the last 10,000 years. And it's the most recent thing in the last 50 years with the popularity of the low-fat diet and the elevation of carbohydrates to the primary foodstuff that humans should be eating. This is what I call the carb scam. We've all been conned by the belief that carbohydrates are very good for us and fat is very bad for us. Now, how did this come about? Well, it's a simple answer, actually. We ran out of meat and fat about 10,000 years ago, so our rulers and leaders convinced the public that they should eat carbohydrates so they could save the meat for themselves. And they succeeded. Now, what eventually happened was the wedding between that kind of coercion and the scientist, which occurred about 1900 with the growth of interest in nutritional science. So we started doing research studies, but we were studying man primarily as a carbohydrate eater, fully adapted to processing carbohydrates and not adapted to processing fat because the exposure to fat was not that high. Now, in the early part of the 1900s, in the first 5 decades, muscle physiologists were very interested in determining the fuel use and the fuel that powered muscular contraction. And they were studying man as a carbohydrate eater. And what they concluded from their studies was that 100% of fuel needs were met by carbohydrates. And that's how the scientific issue of fuel needs for humans came about. It was so entrenched in people's minds during those years in the 1940s and 1950s that no one even paid attention to fat. But then some glitches started to appear. Started studying the fat use and found out that a significant source of the fuel used by muscles was coming from fat. And that set the stage for a whole revolution in terms of biochemical research into fat burning, and muscle use of fuel. And that continued unabated, and some techniques were finally developed in the late 1990s that allowed a complete assessment of fuel used by muscle, and here it was discovered that 95% of the fuel used by muscle was fat. Now, of course, this hasn't gotten out. It's still sitting in the pages of the scientific journals in which it was published, those journals living in the dusty medical libraries. I personally never had any interest in anything other than the idea of what was optimal. So I was not constrained in terms of thinking about whether or not I would consume fat, because most people are. Most researchers are, and they argue that fat will cause heart disease and other diseases. So they're constrained in looking at that. Even if it was good for us to eat fat, we can't, in terms of muscle fuel, body fuel, we can't eat it because it's going to cause all this disease. I was not constrained by that because I learned that that whole thing was constructed, and I learned that about 1980, that the whole thing about fat and cholesterol causing heart disease had been made up. So I could then look into fat, and I did. And I gathered all the scientific research papers that were related to the use of fat as a source of fuel. And, of course, discovered that fat was the primary source of fuel for the body. And if you pushed the body in the right direction so it could burn fat as a source of fuel, and you could manipulate your diet to do this, that was the best thing you could do. So that's the story. And the carb scam is the lie that carbohydrates are the primary fuel, and that's simply not true. I'm Dr. Greg Ellis.